So for 10 years, I was bouncing. I was moving 2 to 3 times a year, sometimes to the same places or within the same countries. But I was still bouncing around because if I stayed, I would have to build relationships. I would have to make friends. I would have to be vulnerable. I would have to try and belong. I would have to try and fit in.
Welcome to International Love Story, the podcast about intercultural relationships. My name is Christina, and in today's podcast episode, I would like to welcome Maria. Maria is living in Denmark at the moment with her family, with her little family. She is a third culture kid. She is in an intercultural relationship herself. And she is going to share her story with us today. She moved, which I think is crazy and mind-boggling, to be honest. She moved 44 times, 9 countries on her list. And let's give a warm welcome to Maria. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. My name is Maria Drizati, and I own Wandering Wisdom Coaching, where I've basically made it my mission to empower young internationals, especially expats, third and cross-cultural kids, to cultivate self-leadership skills and realize their dreams and feel at home no matter where they are. That was always a huge thing for myself growing up, so I've hung on to that. Privately, I'm 38 years old. I am Danish by birth, but grew up in Luxembourg. We moved there when I was 2 years old. And as you mentioned, I've lived in 9 different countries all across Europe. I met my Albanian husband. We met when we were both living in Greece. And then we moved to Spain. We were long distance for a couple of years before we settled in Spain. And we had 2 kids there. And then a couple of years ago, we moved to Denmark. But even though I am originally from Denmark, it's probably one of the countries where I feel the least at home. So it's also been a challenge.
That's definitely going to be a topic I would like to tackle with you later on in this conversation as well, because I read a few things about you online, on your website, especially. What as mentioned before, you moved quite a few times. You have everything basically I'm talking about on my Instagram account, as well as here the podcast, Third Culture Kid, long distance relationship, intercultural couple. You are self-employed, so that means you take your job from one place to the other. So I would love to know more about that. The first question I have for you is what's your love story? How did you get to know each other, and where did it evolve from there on up to now, being in Denmark, having 2 kids and raising your family?
Well, it's been a little over 7 years since we met, and it was quite a whirlwind romance. I don't think I'm saying anything wrong there. I was in Greece for the 2nd or 3rd time running. I used to work in tourism, so I would change every 6 months. I would be somewhere different. But at the time, I had settled so that I was living in Gran Canaria, the Canary Islands in Spain, during the winter, and then I was in Rhodes in Greece during the summer. And one night, I didn't want to go out. I just wanted a calm night in, and a friend of mine convinced me to have a walk through Rhodes Bar Street, just to go for a walk, say hi to a few people, and then I could go home again and sleep, because it wasn't really my thing. And I remember walking past this guy, and he was trying to get us into a bar, and I didn't want to go, so I just walked a big circle around him, and then I went home. Then the next day, I went out with a couple of my staff, and I ran into him again, and we ended up spending the entire night. Even though he was supposed to be working, we ended up sitting in the bar he was working, talking all night. And we've literally been together ever since. He moved in with me 5 days later due to a lack of accommodation. The island was completely full and his apartment had fallen through. And we decided, okay, well, we like each other. He worked nights, I worked daytime. So worst case, we wouldn't be home at the same time anyway. So he ended up living with me for the 3 months that he was in Greece. He was only allowed to be there 3 months due to the Schengen, where Albania is not part of Europe. So he had to go back home after being in Europe for 3 months. So he went back home, and during those 3 months, he'd also proposed. And I thought I was never getting married. I thought I was never going to have the family life. It sounded nice. It just wasn't for me. But I fell head over heels in love, and I ended up saying yes. And 8 months later, we got married in Denmark. because Denmark was the only place we could get married. It is really quite crazy when you look back at it. And yeah, then we did back and forth for a couple of years where I would go, like he was with me in Greece, then he would go home after 3 months, spend 3 months in Albania. In the meantime, I would go back to Spain. Then he would come and join me in Spain, spend 3 months with me in Spain, go back home, stay 3 months in Albania, and again for another round. So we did that for a couple of years until I told my boss I was going back to Gran Canaria and I was staying in Gran Canaria. No more jumping around. And then I officially moved to Spain. And when he'd been home for 3 months, he came with me again. And he stayed there and we applied for family reunification. And he got it. Luckily, because while he was applying, it turned out I was expecting our son, our first child. And then COVID hit. So it was just in time.
How many years were you dating on long distance? 2 years roundabout, like this back and forth?
Yeah, because we met in the summer of 2017. And then he came to Spain at the end of 2018. We got married so early. Not that I would recommend it to anyone if they don't really, really want it. But for us, it also worked as an, okay, there's literally no way out. We got married. And now we're in this. And even on the really, really bad days where without the marriage certificate, maybe it could have been easy to back out because 2.5 years long distance is tough. We still stayed put and we worked through some of our early challenges that then, of course, also more or less dissolved when we were finally in the same country.
How was it in general? Like, because as I understood, he proposed after 3 months of knowing you, or within the 3 months of his Schengen visa. I hope this question is not too personal because you were moving quite fast. So did Nacho and I. I mean, our story is a different one, but between getting to know each other and saying yes to each other, I think we had like 1.5 years and we just saw each other 4 or 5 times in person before we actually got married. How did your family react and your friends react? Did you get any negative feedback or stupid comments or whatever? Like, hey, for example, is it just for the visa?
My mother was the first one I told. And to be fair, a couple of weeks went by. We didn't tell people straight away because I also just had to figure out. I had said yes because I meant yes. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind or in my heart that I meant yes. But I also knew that I would face extra pushback because I had already told my mother that this was not happening. Like family, kids, marriage, that was her dream at one point and not mine. And I had made that very clear by then. So suddenly calling home and being head over heels in love and having to say, okay, so now we're doing it. We're getting married. The kids were still not on the cards. It was still supposed to be a childless relationship. But to call home and say that, still, it was a tough conversation to have because I basically needed to explain why things had changed. And what my mom said and what she's told me later are 2 very different things. Because what she said was, okay, well, if you're in love, we trust you. She told me later was that her and my stepdad decided to come to Spain before we got married, about 4 months later, to basically check that he was an okay guy and to meet him so that if there was anything that felt a bit untoward, then they could have tried to stop it. They didn't. Everything was looking just fine to them as well. But I know that conversation happened behind my back as well. But we had plenty of those. I mean, plenty of people asked me if I wasn't worried if it was just for the visa, both my friends, his friends. So it was uncomfortable to have to go through that round of questioning that people couldn't just accept it. But it was definitely a thing.
How did you react to those questions? Did you take them serious? What would your response?
My response was a flat out no, of course not. And I basically just denied that could even be a possibility. But to be fair, for every time I got asked, I felt a little bit more doubt inside. So we also had the conversation at home. I mean, Aldo and I had the conversation that we were being asked these questions and that it was uncomfortable. And I have asked him flat out a couple of times if it was just for the visa. And of course, then I had to be a judge of character and evaluate if he was telling the truth or not. But eventually I took the risk anyway.
That was a difficult conversation, I can imagine, because obviously you don't want to make him uncomfortable with this question. But obviously, if it's on your mind, you have to address it somehow.
I think I was lucky in a sense because he didn't go into defensive mode. Like, we managed to have the conversation in a way that he didn't feel attacked and he didn't feel like I was asking him if he was lying to me. Like, he understood where the question was coming from, also because he was getting that question himself from his own social circle. So I don't recall it as uncomfortable as it would sound like for others.
Also mentioning before, you are a third culture kid due to the fact that you moved several times, you had to adapt to several circumstances, different languages as well. Do you feel like this also played a big role or is playing a big role in your relationship and maybe even the way you communicate, that you can communicate the way you do and be quite open-minded and direct about your feelings and about your thoughts?
I think that it impacts everything about me, to be honest, not just my relationship. But of course, now that my relationship and my cross-cultural family life is my reality now, I can also see how I wouldn't say I'm a different wife than many others. I don't know how other people are in relationships here in Denmark, but I definitely parent in a different way than other Danish women do. So I can see that the way that I was raised, we moved to Luxembourg when I was 2. And then as a third culture kid, I was raised in Luxembourg. I moved again when I was 17 by myself. So I didn't bounce around like a lot of third culture kids did. But I did grow up in an international environment. I went to the European school where you have one class for every nationality in the European Union. So growing up and being, as you say, open-minded and navigating several languages and being able to express your feelings in several languages has definitely been an interesting thing to take into this relationship, because my husband is Albanian. He had lived outside of Albania when I met him. He had decent English, but compared to the level of English he speaks today, it was horrible back then. So we had so many communication troubles in the beginning because we had a gap between my English capabilities. I mean, I'm practically bilingual or trilingual in the way I grew up, and him still having English as a foreign language. So a lot of things got lost in translation. And sometimes they still do. Like, sometimes he will ask me a question, but he will phrase it as though it's like a suggestion rather than a question. And then things go haywire very, very fast if I'm not careful. If I react too fast, or I don't really listen, or maybe I'm a bit stressed out, or have a kid yelling at me or something like that. So communication is interesting.
I can only agree with that. I mean, English is not our native language either. And there are still up to today, even after 9 years of knowing each other, situations where Nacho, for example, would translate something directly from Spanish to English, and then it might just come off a little bit different because he doesn't have a filter in Spanish. It's just the way he talks. It's just the way he grew up. It's just the language at some point as well. And then he would phrase things quite direct and I would get offended. While else, for example, I actually do the same quite often. But the great thing in our case is that we have the filter kind of thing where you have to translate first. So in a heated argument, I might just not say things always as I think it, at least not in my mother tongue, which is German, because I'm still translating to English and figuring out how to translate it. And sometimes I'm even deciding not to say it at all, because it just might come off weird or too direct or hurtful. And that's the moment I would realize, because I take some extra time to think about it. So definitely having English in your case as the language you're communicating in can be both, I guess, positive and negative. But I think it always depends, or what you have to remind yourself, at least this is what I've learned, is that your partner, he doesn't want to hurt you. He doesn't want anything bad for you. And like reminding yourself on a constant base that maybe things get lost in translation or it's a communication issue, because obviously this could occur in any other relationship as well. I think that's the balance basically especially when communicating in a language that's not your native one.
I absolutely don't have that filter in English. And I think sometimes I wish I did, especially in the beginning of our relationship when he was still learning English. For example, if we were having a conflict, he wouldn't really answer me. I would be talking at him. And then the less he said, the more annoyed I got, the more I kept talking and the less he said. And it took me a while, or I think it took us becoming comfortable in our relationship for me to realize that, well, one thing is that he needs to think about things before he answers. That's just the type he is. But he also needed to find the right words. And because I was just like machine gun talking at him, he couldn't get a word in because he had that translation filter that I didn't have. So once we smoothed that out, there were less conflict.
Yeah, I can imagine. How long did it take approximately between getting to know each other? I mean, obviously in the beginning, you're in the honeymoon phase. Everything is new. Everything is exciting.
And now I'm really looking back here. I think we got to know each other a lot faster than previous relationships I have to compare with, simply because of our situation. I mean, we moved in together after 5 days. And sure, we could have chosen not to spend any time together because we were working different shifts. But when he got out of bed, he would bring me coffee, we would go out for dinner, and he would go to work. And then again in the morning, we would have breakfast together and I would go to work. So we spent quite a lot of very intense time together, very fast, compared to a normal relationship where you go on dates. I mean, our dates happen with our apartment as the basis. So we got to know each other a lot faster. And of course, we also had the deeper conversations, the heavy conversations a lot sooner because we got engaged that fast. But with that said, I think our first fight was when we were not in the same country, which I would not recommend. I'd say get the first fight out of the way when you are there to physically patch it up, because it's so easy to just ignore your phone if you don't want to talk to the other person. So I know of course we resolved it, but I don't actually remember the details of it. I think I've buried it. Well, I think I would have been a completely different person if my mom had never brought me to Luxembourg with her when I was 2. Obviously, at 2 years old, I didn't really have much of a say. And I don't remember the actual transition there or learning new languages for that matter. I mean, it all just came as children just have an easier time adapting. The younger they are, the easier it is. We saw the same with our kids when we moved to Denmark. And I think growing up as a third culture kid, when I was growing up as a third culture kid, this always makes me sound so old when I say it this way, but there was no such thing as a third culture kid. Like, the term was probably coined by someone. I know there were books written about it, but it was not something that international parents knew about. So me as a third culture kid and my friends, my peers, all the third culture kids I grew up around, we were all just raised exactly like our parents would have done it if they had stayed in their home country. So no one considered that we might have identity issues that, like, beyond just being normal teenagers. And no one considered that we would feel rootless and things like that. And I didn't even know that I had peers that felt the same. I found out much later. First of all, I think I was 24 when I stumbled across a book at university. I went to university in the UK, and I stumbled across a book written about third culture kids, and it became my Bible for a while, because I was like, oh my God, this is me. And I had no idea. And my teenage years were, I wouldn't say tough. I know teenagers that have had a worse time, but I carried along with me a deep sense of rootlessness, and I struggled setting healthy boundaries. I didn't know who I was. I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere, like I belonged anywhere. And that's how the 44 move started happening, because I was 14 when I started thinking, okay, I don't fit in here, so I'll go somewhere else. So I started looking at opportunities for doing exchange, like going to the US for a year or something like that. Then that fell through. And in the end, I ended up making a deal with my mom that I would go to boarding school in Denmark, but not like the old fashioned kind of boarding school, but more of like a freer style boarding school where you had your own room, and it was a Danish one, and we settled on one that had an international degree, the international baccalaureate. So that was a deal. So at 17, I moved to Denmark. And in my mind, I was thinking, oh, it's going to be so good because in Denmark, I'll fit in. I have a Danish passport. I speak the language. I'm blonde. I have blue eyes. I was a lot more blonde back then. So I really thought that was the recipe to all my problems, was to move to Denmark. It was just the start of them. I came to Denmark at 17 and I really did not fit in. And I slowly realized over the course of I ended up spending 3 years in Denmark before moving out again, that in Denmark, I was more foreign than anywhere else. I felt more foreign than anywhere else. And I think that then when I left Denmark, I started forgetting that I had felt like that. Because a couple of years later, I tried again, and it was exactly the same. I did not feel like I fit in. So all these like traits of rootlessness and identity issues and the boundary setting that was non-existent, they just came with me, like my own little backpack full of trouble, because I wasn't really dealing with the root of things because no one could tell me what the root of things were. I had no one to mirror me as a teenager, or even when I got a little bit older. It took a while before I started handling all those things. It took many years before I felt like I belonged anywhere. So those feelings went with me for a while there, no matter where I was. So no matter if I was in the UK or in Italy, Bulgaria, Spain, they were following me around. But in Denmark in particular, and I say this as a generalization because it happened the second time, it happened when we moved back a couple of years ago, it can be a struggle to make friends in Denmark because Danish people are a very cold-blooded culture. They have their circle of friends and they don't open up easily to strangers. So coming to Denmark and trying to make friends, even though I went to boarding school where you would think, but there are lots of people that are the same. Yeah, but I came in a year too late. If I had started a year earlier, I would have bonded with that group. But they had already bonded a year ahead. So it took time to kind of settle. And I did end up with friends. But it was definitely an element of it that breaking into people's existing social structures is super difficult in Denmark. It still is. It's the number one problem that expats have in Denmark is to make friends. So that was part of it. But I had family who told me that I didn't belong when I was younger. When I first started talking about wanting to move to Denmark, I had a family member telling me, but how are you going to do that? You don't fit in here. You're different. So I also had this story telling me that although I deeply, deeply wanted to fit in, I probably shouldn't expect to do so because someone who did fit in had told me I would not. Then there's just the identity. It's a whole different background. Growing up in Luxembourg, which is rather wealthy, there's no way around that. I mean, Luxembourg is a wealthy country. And even though my mom was a single mother and was by no means rich, it was still a different upbringing than the average Danish family. So people would also judge based on what they thought Luxembourg was before they gave me a chance. So there were so many different dynamics at play, and I've never, despite what I work with today, I've never sat down and completely dissected all of them because I'm not such a fan of looking way too far back when it comes to cleaning up your baggage. I prefer looking ahead. But just so many different dynamics at play, both like societal structures and of course also the ones that came from my upbringing, from my family, from my experiences.
Especially as a young woman, I mean, you were a teenager and this is the phase where you, up to the age of 25, you build your character, if that makes sense, your personality. This is when you start growing personally as well. And that's basically shaped by having all those different impacts surrounding you. And you are much more vulnerable in a young age than, for example, nowadays, where you know who you are, what to expect from life, where you want to go, and where you see yourself in the future, for example. And then this feeling of feeling lost, I think that's one of the worst feelings you can have as a teenager, and that just kept on following you no matter where you were, no matter in which country. And you were just like, at some point, I would be like, what am I actually looking for? Obviously, I can't find it. Where is that thing I'm looking for? So my question to you, did you find it?
Some days more than others. What I realized is that it's not something I can find anywhere. It's a state of mind. It's a way of being. It's acceptance. A lot of it is acceptance. That no, I don't necessarily call myself Danish or Luxembourgish or Spanish. I have places where I feel more at home than others, but please don't ask me where I'm from. And that actually don't ask any third culture kid where they're from, because I think it's everyone's pet hate question. But when I went to uni in the UK and people would ask me where I was from, I frequently lied. I tried out different things just to see how they felt. Occasionally I said I was from Luxembourg. Occasionally I would say I was Danish. I've also, someone thought I was South African, and I just let them go with it. So, I was trying on different hats to see which one was more comfortable and which one came with fewer follow-up questions. Because if I said the truth, well, I am Danish by birth, but I grew up in Luxembourg, that came with a lot of questions. So that wasn't a safe one. So I had to find another way to answer that question. And today I found out that I don't have to answer that question. I can just say that I am from, today I live in Korsør. So if someone I don't know asks me where I'm from, I just say Korsør, because I also know they're not interested in my life story. They're not on they're on a need to know basis. But when I was 17, 18, 19, 20, I thought when people asked me that question, they wanted to know. So it took me a lot of growing up before I realized I don't owe anyone an answer. And that brought with it a lot of peace. So a lot of recognizing who I am has happened in all the work I've been doing with myself throughout my training in coaching. And sometimes I still feel a bit rootless. And sometimes I still want to pack a bag and hop on the next plane and leave. But I have strategies in place now that help me navigate all of that. So it's a lot easier to handle than it was when I was 20 and I didn't know anything.
So you combined your experience in a way to give back to anyone who is feeling similarly to how you felt back then. I would like to learn more about your expertise. I kind of have an idea what brought you to where you are at the moment, but I feel like there's still some pieces missing to combine the whole picture, if that makes sense. So I'm wondering, what is your passion and how do you transmit this passion and how do you help others?
I think one of the pieces missing is that, as I mentioned earlier, I worked in tourism for a while, both academically and professionally. I have a background in tourism management. As a destination manager in the tourism industry, I had very young teams. So I was in my mid-20s by then, and obviously only growing older because I did this for almost 10 years. But I started in my mid-20s. And in the beginning, to be fair, I was not a very good manager. And it horrifies me to say that today, but it's the truth. I mean, what I did wasn't working. So I started looking for solutions. And I think that's one of the things as a third culture kid, you become super adaptable. So you don't get hung up too much in crisis because you're so used to change that you don't get hung up in the problems. You get hung up on the solutions. And as a manager that wasn't really doing too well, I wanted to figure out what could work because I had these very, very young employees coming out. It was their first time abroad and they were not thriving. And when they were not thriving, they were not doing a good job. And when I, as a manager, was not doing a good job, of course, that trickled down. So I reached out to books about coaching and I found out that there's these techniques you can use. And if you ask questions the right way, you can get people to feel more empowered, more autonomous, like they have a say in things. And when they feel like that, they take ownership. And when they take ownership, they do a better job. And so I started using everything that I was researching in my job. And by the time I finished in that business, I basically sat back and said, okay, what do I want to do now? Like which parts of this job, because there's so many elements in this job, which parts of this job do I want to keep? What did I love doing? And what would I rather not do anymore? For example, working 24/7 all year, that was parked. I did not need to continue doing that, but I would love to keep helping people grow. Like, I trained staff from the bottom. I had a super track record when it came to developing staff and making them adept at doing their jobs. But I also had a good track record at the personal development part. So it was from there and from seeing so many people grow and really like grow their wings under my care that I thought, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to spend my life on. So I trained during COVID. I gave birth to my first son. My husband was also home, which freed up some space, some time. So I was able to train as a coach during COVID and do an online coaching certification with one of the biggest Danish providers. They went online since it was COVID, so that worked very well in my favor. And then I went on and I studied to become a master coach. I've specialized in leadership, conflict, stress. So I have quite a large toolbox by now. Then someone told me, well, if you really want to succeed, you need to pick a niche. Like, you can coach anyone, sure you can. But if you say you can coach everyone, you'll end up coaching no one. So I started looking at, well, who can I help? Who do I know better than they know themselves? And I know that sounds a little bit arrogant, but that was basically how I was looking at my life, is like, where have I been and who can I help? And that ended up becoming, in the beginning, it was expats in general. Then I realized it's not expats in general. It's young internationals, it's young expats, it's third and cross-cultural kids. It's like that group aged from around 16 to 30 that are either abroad because their parents told them to. They didn't have a choice in the matter. And like, they were not asked if they wanted to go anywhere. Their choice was taken away from them. And then there are the young internationals that go, I want to study abroad, and they go abroad to have the adventure of their life. And then it falls through for some reason or another, because it wasn't quite what they thought it would be. So it became quite a broad niche, but I really like helping these young internationals because I feel like with the right support, they can get everything out of their adventure abroad that they hoped it would be to begin with. And of course, with third culture kids, I've been there. I know it very well. But I've also moved abroad as an expat, of course, with the TCK baggage. But I went to study in the UK. I've worked abroad. I've been stationed abroad as part of my job. And it's different aspects that pop up along that you need to navigate. And sure, when you're single, it's super easy to pack up your bag and leave again. But it's also a shame, I think, that today many people will just pack up their bag and leave if it's not working, rather than making it work. Now, the ones of us that end up in international cross-cultural relationships, we get an extra reason to stay. And today I also have a couple of kids that keep me grounded. But when you're single, you have your suitcase. It's super easy to leave. I'm a prime example of that. That was my escape strategy every single time. And that's why I've moved 44 times, and it's only between 9 different countries. It's because I set up my career for a while to be seasonal, because then I never had to stay anywhere for too long. So for 10 years, I was bouncing. I was moving 2 to 3 times a year, sometimes to the same places or within the same countries. But I was still bouncing around because if I stayed, I would have to build relationships. I would have to make friends. I would have to be vulnerable. I would have to try and belong. I would have to try and fit in. But because of the way I built my career, I could just focus on my job and move on. So it basically became one big strategy for not committing to anything for a long time there. And I think there's a lot more to be had from life if you can avoid some of those strategies. So those are in large part the young people that I help. They tend to have some similar strategies popping up in their toolbox.
Especially nowadays, where it's just so easy to go from one place to the other, especially in Europe, obviously. But yeah, I mean, as a young person, this is how I felt back then. You want to explore the world, you want to see as much as possible, not really being tied to a place. And that's the beauty of it. But how challenging it can be to adapt every single time, especially when there's a completely different culture involved. a completely different way on how to make friends and how to socialize. The language barrier eventually you might have, this is still something I'm struggling with here in Argentina. Yeah, it just becomes a burden and you question yourself. First of all, was that the right decision? And second of all, you start maybe even doubting yourself. And I think that's the point where you should definitely seek help and get out there with your story and find like-minded people, and in the best case, find someone who's helping you to navigate through all of this. Because in my opinion, we've managed our intercultural relationship somehow as well. But I would have been so happy and relieved if I would have known back then, for example, that there are so many more out there struggling with the same topics as struggled with back then when we got to know each other, the whole long distance thing. And now eventually, let's see how things are working. I mean, you never know, but we're also planning on building a family, for example, and that's just going to be a different layer. And I'm so happy that I know that there are people out there I can contact that are sharing their advice with me. And then it's just up to me to make it work. But I know it works. And that's already like such a relief, especially if you have someone who has been there a couple of times, who's speaking out of experience and who can guide you through this. I think that's just such a big value because you know what you're talking about. It's just not blah, blah. You have been there. You know how it feels. And that's the beauty of it. So for everyone who is interested in getting in contact with you, who might struggle with adapting, finding their way as a young intercultural kid, like you said, between 16 and 30 roundabout, who wants to fulfill their full potential, to grow those wings, what's the best way to get in contact with you, and how would you move on from there?
The absolute easiest way is either my website or my Instagram account. So you can drop me a message on Instagram, or you can go onto my website and book a clarity call with me. My booking calendar is straight there, so you can just book in a time that suits you. And if there's nothing that suits you, you can also drop me an email through my contact form. What I've also done, because of the age range I work with, these clarity calls, I also offer them as a chat function. So if you're not a fan of phone calls, because I've had quite a lot of younger clients who actually don't like phone calls in the beginning. They prefer a messaging service of some sort. So we still book in a clarity call with a specific time, but then they have the option to choose if they want it as a chat or if they want to actually phone up and talk to me. So we can navigate around that as well. That was an interesting thing for me because I certified as a master coach specializing in children and youth coaching as well. So I dare to go under 18 for those who need me. But that was really a wake-up call when I started working with 15, 16, 17-year-olds, that so many of them actually dislike that the first contact is a normal phone call. So there are different options, but the website or Instagram is definitely the easiest one.
Thank you for sharing this. Obviously, as always, I'm going to link everything in the side notes as well as in the YouTube description. One other question I usually ask everyone, that's actually one of my favorite questions, and I think I've mentioned it so many times in this podcast already that this is my favorite question, but it really is, what's your biggest advice? It can be personal advice from your experience, can be relationship advice, can be anything, any big learnings in your life, for example.
I have two. Can I mention both of them?
Of course.
One is on the topic of moving abroad, like when you are moving abroad, and that doesn't matter what age you have. But if you're moving abroad and you're moving abroad by yourself or as part of a relationship or you're married, have a strategy in place for when the honeymoon phase is over. Right now I have a friend whose daughter they're half Danish, half Italian, and the daughter is moving to Denmark soon after having grown up in Italy. And the first thing I said to her when we were talking about that was make sure she has a strategy for when things start going not so well, for when you start becoming homesick, for when you feel awkward, for when you feel like you don't fit in, for when you just want to go home. What do you do? So have a strategy in place for when the honeymoon phase is over. And then in general, know your own voice. And I know that's a bit of a cliche, but what I found growing up the way I did was that I didn't know who I was. Like I couldn't distinguish my voice from the inner voices I had of parents and other authority figures, I didn't know which one was mine. I didn't know what I actually felt and thought. I didn't know what my boundaries were. So that is my biggest advice to anyone, is really know your own voice, because you have all the answers yourself if you can hear them.
Thank you so much. A lot of those things you've shared with us today, I can resonate with 100%, especially the aspect of moving abroad. That's also a big topic of my content, what I find interesting. And I'm thinking about that basically every time I see old pictures, for example, of Nacho and I, or just pictures of me when I was, 17 or 18 doing my training, that I don't recognize the person in those pictures anymore. Like the person myself, but also, for example. And that's just so interesting in a way and really makes you think. And those are the moments you realize that all the challenges you had to overcome, all those beautiful moments, all those new circumstances you threw yourself in, they made you grow beyond, up to a point where back then you wouldn't even have thought about it. Never ever would I have thought, for example, that I would move to Miami, even though I hated it, and I moved there for love. And I struggled and I was in so much pain and I felt like no one is understanding me and I have to push through that alone. But you don't have to push through that alone. And that's the great thing about our online world nowadays, is that you can seek help and you can connect with others, as mentioned before, with like-minded people and exchange experiences. And I think that's also one of those big pros of globalization, for example. It's just so easy to go from one country to the other, to meet other internationals and to learn so much more about other cultures. But what I think is the most beautiful part while doing all this, that you learn so much about yourself as well. And that's the beauty of it. And that's what I love. And I feel like you can agree with that, because you're also very passionate about that topic, especially if you have an impact on younger people. Yeah, that they will always be grateful for your help and for your advice and for your guidance. And sometimes it just needs someone from outside to show you that there are different ways of tackling specific things, or to tell you like, hey, you're not a weirdo. That's normal what you're going through. That also helps.
Exactly. Just knowing that you are not alone. Other people have been through the same thing or are currently going through the same thing. And you are not weird. But also a big one that I struggled with was that the reactions I got when I told people where I lived or what I was doing when I was basically traveling for work, it's like, oh my God, that's so amazing. That's brilliant. That's so special. I was like, no, I'm not special. Like for me, it was normal. And of course, I could see that it wasn't normal for everyone else, but I really didn't like it when people tried to make my life into something picture perfect, because I had my own struggles that they knew nothing about, and it just became so awkward. I don't know, have you ever been through, like when you say you live in Argentina and people go, oh my God, that's so crazy. That's so cool.
Yeah, quite often actually. And I'm actually sick of telling our story, to be honest. It's not like I like to share it on social media because I can control the comments or just not react on them. But if someone is asking me directly, or like this reaction you've just mentioned, that's like being over the moon and super fascinated. I understand the fascination behind it. Again, like back then, I would have been fascinated about it myself when getting to know someone in the situation we are nowadays. But then on the other hand, it's our life. We're figuring things out as we're going. As you said, we're also not picture perfect. And that's also not what we are reflecting, or what I want to reflect, for example, on social media, that everything is just like, oh my God, intercultural relationships are just amazing and no hurdles at all. And you get to know yourself and a different culture and blah, blah, blah. Like in reality, it just brings its own challenges, like any other relationship as well. But it's, again, I understand the fascination behind it, but what I think a lot of people are forgetting, that you and I, we're just living our life and we don't have the answers to all questions out there either. And I feel like this is also sometimes what people kind of not expect is the wrong word. How do I phrase it correctly? They kind of share your wisdom. You have seen so much, you've experienced so much. Share your wisdom with me. I have no idea what I'm talking about most of the time. Leave me alone. I mean, again, I love to share our story on social media. Obviously, I'm here to answer all questions. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead. But it's just a normal relationship. It's our normal life. And again, we're figuring things out as we go along with it. So as mentioned, I'm going to link everything in the side notes as well as in the description. Thank you so much for sharing your advice, for sharing your story. And as always, there's so much more we could talk about. Time, unfortunately, is a little bit limited. Otherwise, I think I'd have podcast episodes that are 3 hours long. But really, those who are listening or watching right now, go ahead, contact Maria directly. There's no such thing as stupid questions. I know that's a little bit cliche as well, but it's actually true. Especially if you can relate with anything she just shared with us, feel free to reach out to her. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today. And I know it's late in Denmark right now. It's after 12 now. And I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.